The thing that unites Democrats is that we really, really, really don't want Donald Trump to be president. And I think if that is your North Star, then it makes a lot of sense what people are doing.
No, that I definitely see that. And yeah, he is, Trump is by far one of the best organizers of the Democratic Party right now. And that will do a lot to unite the party. But yeah.
Negative partisanship rules everything around us.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to another episode of Power and Flower. My name is Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics in 2024. We also care deeply about pastries. Today, we are going to talk about the latest fascinating, amazing thing happening in U.S. politics. And the fact that you don't know what I'm talking about just gives you an idea of what this month has been like. It's been a real week lately, but we're going to talk about Joe Biden's announcement that he is not standing for re-election. And then the party's very rapid coordination behind Kamala Harris as his successor. So there's a lot of different aspects I want to get into, and a fair amount of this has been covered on the news. But John, I want to actually start off by asking you a pretty key question about the polling on this. Now, it's still, we're recording this, just a little more than a day after Biden's announcement. There's been some recent polling showing Biden trailing Trump by maybe 2 points, Harris trailing by less than that, maybe tied. As far as I know, we have no serious polling numbers since Biden's announcement on Sunday. I just would like to get your sense of are these numbers from before Biden's announcement useful? What's your assessment about how much of a difference it makes to have Kamala Harris as the nominee, assuming that happens, as opposed to Joe Biden?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It is Monday afternoon. This news has been out for 24 hours. So, I think the most important thing is that this is going to need some time to work through, and voters are not obsessing about this in the same way that you and I and people listening to this probably are. Folks are going to take a little bit of time to get up to speed. So I think the first most important thing is nobody should jump to conclusions. But there is a lot of interesting polling data from the last couple weeks, in the sort of post-debate world, when calls for Biden to step down started to get a lot louder in the Democratic Party. Some people started to do some research to figure out what happened. You saw some data from the New York Times Siena poll. They did polls in Virginia and in Pennsylvania, both of which showed Harris running a couple points better than Biden. I work at a company called Civics, which does online tracking polls. We did some polls for a client in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin for a client called Rust Belt Rising. They released those polls a few days before Biden made his announcement. This showed Harris running 3 points better than Biden in Pennsylvania and Michigan, which are obviously really important places. And then, at Civics, we also do our own tracking polls. And we started asking about Harris a couple of weeks ago, and we've seen, a pretty clear difference in how Harris is performing versus Trump. We're still working on some of these numbers. We're still building up the sample size. But what we're seeing is that Harris does better than Biden did with a lot of really important voter groups, particularly younger people, African-American voters, and Hispanic voters. And in this case, it's not that Harris is taking votes away from Trump, but Harris seems to be taking votes away from undecided and third-party candidates. There were a ton of people who've been telling pollsters for 2 years now that they like Democrats, they mostly want Democrats to be in charge, but they didn't think that Joe Biden was up to the job. And that's how you have, Democratic Senate candidates in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Ohio, running dramatically better than Biden was. Folks were very comfortable with the idea of voting for a Dem. They just didn't want to vote for Joe Biden. What we're seeing right now is some early indications that Harris may be able to get some of those folks back into the party.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, one of the things I've been curious about, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, is that there were a lot more undecideds than we would usually expect to see. And these are people who I think would normally vote Democratic. they might have ended up voting for Biden in the end anyway, but they were seeming really hesitant. And it sounds like Harris would be picking up some of these more hesitant but Democratic leaning voters.
Yeah, I think that's the early indication. And I think it's really
Okay.
important for folks to remember that Donald Trump seems to have a ceiling at about 46%. He got 46% of the vote in the 2016 national election. He got 46.9% of the vote in 2020. I do think it's always worth pointing out he got a higher share of the vote losing in 2020 than he did winning in 2016.
Yeah, it was weird.
And so the question for Democrats is, you know, is 46% going to be enough for him to win this time? And because of the inherent advantage for Republicans, the Electoral College, and with Robert Kennedy on the ballot, with Jill Stein, with Cornel West, with all these folks, were there enough sort of third party spoiler candidates and enough of a built-in advantage that Republicans get every time that they file for a national election? Was that 46 or 47% going to be enough for Trump? And when Biden was running, I think the indication was probably it would, because there were so many folks who were uncomfortable with him.
Right.
I think the interesting polling question for Harris is going to be, can she put together a coalition of folks who would vote for any Democrat, no matter who they were, and enough of the people who maybe were uncomfortable with Biden to convince them to come with her to make that Trump segment of the electorate not enough to win.
Okay. Now, I'm sort of curious what you think about how reliable is polling done before compared to now? Like, when people are thinking like in the abstract of, if Biden were to step down and Kamala Harris were to replace him, how would you support her? Is that a very different question for people than it would be today? And might they be answering that question differently?
I think it might be. And, we'll have to wait and see how the next couple of weeks of polling come out. At Civics, we poll people every day, so it gives us an interesting chance to look at, how things change. But I think you can imagine a couple different kinds of people who would respond to the Harris and Trump question before Biden dropped out differently than they do now. I think, on the one hand, you've got people who think of themselves as Biden loyalists, think of themselves as good Democrats. And when Biden was saying he was going to run, they might have been more reluctant to tell a pollster that they were for Harris because they didn't want to seem ungenuous, right? Like, I think one of the things that we've seen is that Harris's approval ratings have been lower with Democrats than you would expect over the last couple of weeks. And I think some of that may have been people not wanting to get ahead of the leadership of the party. So you may see a little bit of improvement for her on that side. I think on the other side, there are some independents and Republicans who didn't think that Biden was up for the job and who wanted to encourage Biden to get out, who may have been telling folks that they would be open to a non-Biden Democrat. But in reality, if they're Republicans, they're probably going to vote for Trump anyway, right? And so there may also be a little bit of that, like, we want to tell people, we want to give encouragement to Biden to get out. So I think maybe some people will respond differently when it's the real campaign. But I think for most folks, the early indications that Democratic based constituencies are coming back to the level of support that we'd expect. I think that's a good sign, and we'll see what happens.
Okay. Question for you. I mean, one of the things that has really fascinated me, and I wrote about this on my Substack, I'll link to that, was the speed with which the broader Democratic Party seems to have coordinated behind Kamala Harris. That is, Biden announced he was stepping down. This is around 2 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday. And then just a few minutes after that announcement, he announced that he was backing Kamala Harris. That was followed quickly by endorsements for Harris by Bill and Hillary Clinton, then Elizabeth Warren and a bunch of other members of Congress and Democratic governors and some interest groups. Within 24 hours, she really had endorsements by just about every potential rival for the presidency, as well as former Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So this really kind of stunned me. This is something that could have been very messy. This was something it could have been a floor fight at the convention. It really doesn't look like that now. It looks like it's just going to be very clear sailing. And I'm wondering what your take on this level of coordination is. Like, was this just basically a plan in advance? Was this just kind of an obvious coordination point for the party, and a party that was very eager to just end all this drama? I'm sort of curious how you read this.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things there. I don't think it was a plan, and that like all these people knew that Biden was dropping out on July 21st, and then they need to move. Like that is not the case. From you know the even some very serious Biden campaign aides found out 1 minute before the public did. So there's not a secret plan behind the scenes. I think what you're seeing though is the Democratic Party wants to be united. We really like getting along. We really like having one standard bearer. I was joking yesterday with some friends that both Democrats and Republicans would rather be fighting Republicans. That we don't like having things be messy. Whereas I think sometimes the Republican Party does revel in that sort of inter-Republican ideological warfare. Is just not a comfortable place for Dems to be. I also think that the timing, the fact that the decision is in the hands of 4,000 very, very committed Democratic Party activists who've been elected as the delegates to the convention, right? These are folks who are really predisposed to wanting everything to be smooth and organized. And so you add to the fact that like Harris could inherit the Biden Harris campaign war chest. Only Harris could easily, have the staff transition, have all the offices, have all of the agreements, all of the like logistics of running a campaign. She is uniquely suited to take on. And then, I think the bigger point in voters' minds is that Biden and Harris have been a team. He chose Kamala Harris as the person to take over for him if he couldn't be president. And we have, as a party, have had now 4 years of getting used to that idea of she is the successor. She's the person who will take over when his race is run. And I think it was a very easy transition to be like, great, that's what's supposed to happen now, right? That is literally the vice president's job, is to take over when needed, and it's needed, and here she goes. Yeah, like I think that a contested convention would have been fun. The poli-sci nerds would have had a great time. It would have been incredibly messy. The fact that all of a sudden it would be these 4,000 people who were mostly elected as Biden delegates who then had to interpret what that means. The rules of the convention are that you have to try to represent the interests of the people who chose you, but what does that mean? And it would have been just an unbelievable mess. So I think that the thing that unites Democrats is that we really, really, really don't want Donald Trump to be president. And I think if that is your North Star, that it makes a lot of sense what people are doing.
No, that I definitely see that. And yeah, he is, Trump is by far one of the best organizers of the Democratic Party right now. And that will do a lot to unite the party. But, yeah.
Negative partisanship rules everything around us.
Yes.
Yeah, like I know you've done a lot of research into sort of party organizations and party structures. Are you surprised that the party, which is so, I guess, given who this decision is in the hands of, are you surprised that they have moved so quickly?
I mean, I guess there's a number of things here that at least somewhat surprised me. I mean, for me, the most surprising thing, honestly, in the abstract here is that the Democratic Party, broadly speaking, pressured Joe Biden out of the presidency, which in some ways seems obvious to people. I mean, yes, he did poorly in the debate. There was a lot of pressure coming from a lot of different sources, from media to entertainment to donors, and then ultimately from people like Pelosi and Obama and others, people who Biden can't really just dismiss outright. But like, one of the concerns I've always had about the way our party system works is that I think parties have or can have some strengths, right? They do have some ability to shape choices that voters have. They can steer nominations. But generally, our parties are really deferential to presidents. And if a president, regardless of how good their campaign looks, if a president wants to stand for re-election, a party doesn't really have much choice over whether to accept them. And this one actually pushed Biden out. Now, maybe that might have not worked with a different candidate. Biden is someone who actually takes being a Democrat very seriously. It's a huge part of his identity with the party. That really stunned me that happened. I guess following that, I thought it could have been a way messier process, and I kind of expected. I was assuming that the party would have probably coalesced behind Harris before the convention started. I didn't expect it would happen within 24 hours. I thought there might have been, I don't know if it would have been Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or a few other names might have had their names out there for a while, and then slowly would have seen that it's not going to happen for them. But this all happened at like light speed, as far as I could tell.
Yeah. No, and I think that there's people generally in the party have good feelings about Kamala Harris. I think they are also, the Democratic Party is very attuned to what the politics of saying to a African American and South Indian American woman who had been the vice president and was the clear successor, what it would mean to tell her, no, we are going to skip over you and go to someone else, is something that the 4,000 people elected to be the delegates to the Democratic Party just would be profoundly uncomfortable doing. And I think that had they done, that would have had really terrible ramifications for the general election campaign. So, I think that had Joe Biden chosen Amy Klobuchar instead of Kamala Harris to be his running mate, maybe this transition would have been a little bit messier. But I think that, Harris, most Democrats think has done a solid job as vice president, but especially think she's done an incredible job over the last 3 weeks when things have been really hard, right? Since the debate, she has been under a microscope, and it would have been really easy to take a wrong step, and she didn't. And I've talked to a lot of Democrats who, 3 weeks ago, if you said Biden or Harris, they would have been like, I'm not sure what the better answer is here. Have been really impressed with how well she's handled herself.
I would agree with that. Yeah, that was an easy situation to screw up, and she did not screw it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. She played that well. She knew, like, if she didn't need to add to the pressure on Biden, and she stood to benefit from the other pressure that people were providing. So, I think she handled it well. And I agree with you. Like, prior to this year, anyway, like I think there was a lot of concern about her as a future presidential candidate, just because she was not particularly popular. She was, a lot of that I think people knew is simply because she was tied to a fairly unpopular president. And part of it is that, like, vice presidents kind of always look like idiots, just as part of the nature of the job. And it's hard to know if you're doing well at a job that no one really knows what the job description is. And
right.
That there was always probably some sort of penalty for Black women in a high profile job like this. But so, there's no guarantee she's going to win this thing, but
No.
I think she's probably got a better shot than the party did before, and I think Democrats are excited to rally behind her for this.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think everybody's mental model here should be that the likeliest outcome of this election is that Trump wins, right? Like, Republicans have a built-in advantage in the Electoral College. All across the world, as we've talked about, people are unhappy with the people who are in charge. That, there's they've got a lot of things going for them. But I think that having a candidate who is forcefully out there, it'll be good for the Democratic Party. It's also just good for democracy overall, right? Like, having people going out and, trying to win votes and run aggressive campaign schedules, I think will be really good. But I have some questions for you from a political science perspective on this. All of the poli-sci research that I've ever read sort of starts by assuming that incumbency is one of the most powerful factors that folks have, right? That especially if you're in Congress, but in incumbent presidents running for re-election very rarely lose, and that power is, that incumbency is a really important part of getting reelected. What do you think? Do you think the Democrats are giving something important up by switching here? Do you think, does the poli-sci research, do we just not have enough elections like this for that incumbency to understand the impact of that? How do you think about what kind of world we're moving into here?
So this is an interesting question, and there's honestly there's some research on this question. Incumbency effect is a pretty long-standing finding in U.S. politics, that particularly for like members of Congress, incumbents tend to do better. Now, there's legitimately for a while been some question. It's like, is that because they're incumbents? That is like, are they able to take advantage of the features of being in office and use that to win elections? Or is it actually some sort of selection effect where the people who are better at running campaigns end up in office? Setting that aside, though, and this is kind of an interesting thing, there's been some studies suggesting that the incumbency effect has been waning over time. It's been getting smaller. That's been tracked in congressional elections where like it used to be maybe worth between like 5 or 10%. And in more recent years, it's down below 5%. It might not even exist anymore. And partially that might be kind of a polarization thing where people are just much more voting party line than they used to. And they don't really care that much about who the incumbent is. But it's an interesting effect. And we've seen it at the presidential level as well. George W. Bush was the last president to do better in his second run than in his first. I mean, I guess, as you pointed out, Trump is sort of a weird case because he actually got a slightly higher percentage his second time around, but he lost. But it was, he did roughly the same from one election to the next. Obama did a little worse his second time up. Biden was certainly on track to do worse his second time up. So, I think there's a real question of just how beneficial it is to be an incumbent anymore.
Yeah. And, I think there's some hope that Harris can get the benefits of being an incumbent where she wants, where she can talk, make the Biden-Harris record the Harris record where it's convenient, and right. And leave the parts where it's less convenient aside. So we'll see if that happens. But I think, there will certainly be a lot of political science research that's written about this in the years to come. I think from the other perspective, a lot of people you see online and folks that you talk to expressing some concerns that because Harris is a woman and because especially she's a woman of color, that there are voters that she can't get to. Some people would say, America isn't going to vote for a woman candidate for president. I don't share that personally. What do you think the political science research says about women and people of color, and especially women of color, as electoral candidates?
So this is one of those fascinating areas where the research suggests that there isn't much of a difference, but that a lot of people believe there is. That is, there's a wonderful book from a few years ago called Small Power by a couple of political scientists where they focused on like local party organizers, local party chairs, trying to get a sense of what they're looking for when they recruit candidates. And both Democratic and Republican leaders were saying they prefer to recruit women because they think they're better candidates. They're harder workers. They're willing to do more effort. They're willing to put in more time to raising money, to learning the issues. But they also are fearful that voters don't like them as much, so they're hesitant to nominate them, which I think is a fascinating set of findings right there. The actual evidence on this is kind of fascinating. There are a few different studies, including some by colleague of mine, Chris Kantak at University of Pittsburgh. She and others have found that basically male and female candidates, at least at the congressional level, they do just about as well as each other. The difference being that women candidates tend to have more experience when they run. That is probably helpful. So that there may actually be a bias against women, but the women who actually run tend to be higher quality candidates to jump in the first place. And so it ends up evening out. And, partially that's an effect of, women are constantly told they're not good enough for this, and men kind of automatically think they're qualified to do anything.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things working at there simultaneously.
I know Emily's list. Emily's list believes that you need to ask a woman to run for office 3 or 4 times in order for her to take it seriously as an idea, which I think bears out what you're saying.
Yes. Whereas you need to tell a man he can't run 3 or 4 times before he'll listen to you. But yes.
And how about people of color? I think that there's, obviously we've got a long and ugly racial history in our politics, but in the modern era, I always think about how Barack Obama won states that Democrats have not come close to winning again. Indiana, um, and that people want to assume that there's an electoral penalty here, but I'm not sure that there's a lot of evidence to support that.
There's not a ton of evidence, and the thing is, like, obviously, we actually have like a substantial history in recent decades of black candidates and black office holders in Congress and in state legislatures. But the thing that makes that tricky is that they mostly represent districts with a high percentage of voters of color. And it's the whiter candidates who run in the whiter districts. So we don't necessarily get like, an apples to apples comparison. But there may be some penalty among white voters for black candidates. It's not enormous. And again, the example of Barack Obama is really quite striking. Not that should tell us everything, but the fact that, there's not very many presidents who have won 2 terms with majority votes both times. One of the few who's done that is, a black liberal from Chicago with a Muslim middle name. A lot of people are convinced that, like, a lot of Democrats in particular are just like, if you gave them that description today, they'd be like, well, there's no way we can run that person. And it wasn't that long ago that he did extremely well in elections.
Yeah. And if you look at the sort of county by county and town by town geography, it's also really clear that there are millions of Americans who voted for Barack Obama twice and then have voted for Donald Trump twice. And that those are real people. And
yes,
and it can be hard to understand how you would come to that position, but a lot of people did.
Yeah. I'm actually curious, briefly on this. What is your impression about how the Trump campaign pivots? I mean, Donald Trump was all over his Truth Social yesterday, kind of freaking out about this clearly and complaining that it was not fair, that he put so much effort into insulting Joe Biden and now he has to insult someone else entirely different. He doesn't know what to do. Do they need to run a very different campaign? I mean, is a lot of this just tying whoever the Democratic nominee is to voter dissatisfaction with the economy or anything else, or how do they transition this?
Yeah, look, I think that they are going to have to pivot. There are some attacks that every Democrat knows that they're going to get, right? Like, they're going to get called radical left wing. They're going to get called soft on crime. They're going to get called, open border. Like, there are things that they would say about literally anybody. But, what the campaign has been really focused on is Biden's age for a long time. And that message not only isn't relevant for Harris, it, I think, actually is going to backfire on them, right? Like, Donald Trump can't stay awake during his own convention. Like, when his son was making a speech about him, he fell asleep. And they spent a long time getting reporters and voters to think that a candidate's age was a really legitimate issue. And so not only have they lost that attack, they have set themselves up to be scrutinized on it. I think it'll be really interesting to see how the campaign talks about Harris herself. A lot of the sort of the Trump people online have already started saying some kind of unhinged things that I don't think are really helpful. Right? Like, prominent conservatives talking about how since Harris doesn't have children of her own, she has no stake in the future of the country. Like, there's all sorts of nonsense out there. I think the Trump campaign has been more disciplined this year than 4 years ago. And I think that they will avoid the most obvious landmines there. But it'll be very curious. I think one thing that I'm going to be curious to see is that Harris has a record as a prosecutor. And a lot of the attacks on her from her left in California were that she was too hard on crime, that she was too much of a cop. And I think you saw in her short-lived presidential race in 2019, them really trying to run away from that. It'll be very interesting to me to see, like, does Harris embrace that messaging again? And, what does Trump do to try to, the main attack points that they had on Biden were age, inflation, and crime. And do they still take the crime message to Harris, or do they sort of pivot away from that if she's showing some strength? I think we will just have to see. I am glad that Biden waited until after the Republican convention to do this, because I do think it's great that 4 days of programming about Biden are all out the window. But that's me being partisan.
I think that was actually pretty shrewd maneuvering right there. Yeah, just make them complain about him, and then he's suddenly not there anymore. Can I pivot to a pastry question for you?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So the topical thing here is that Kamala Harris is a foodie. She is, if she ends up being elected president, she would be one of the very few presidents who is actually like prides themselves on cooking well. And if I don't know if any of you saw this, but at the beginning of COVID, some members of Congress were actually making like some fun cooking videos, and she's got some great ones in there where she's like, schooling Mark Warner on how to make tuna salad and stuff like that. It's really quite delightful. I'll try and find one of those and post them. But you had some information about Harris's history as a baker. I was curious to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah. First of all, if you look at her cooking videos, she has mastered the one-handed egg crack, which I struggle with sometimes. I'll be honest. I tend to crack over the rim and then use both hands. But in her videos, she has mastered the whack and release. But in her first year as vice president, there was a summit in Paris. It was sort of while COVID was rearing. She was over in France, and she went to a store in my old neighborhood after I had my midlife crisis and I moved to pastry school, or I moved to France to go to pastry school. I lived in an area called the Rue Montorgueil, and in that neighborhood is the single greatest kitchenware store in the entire world. It's called Ida Hilleran. It's where Julia Child did all of her shopping. And it has not changed since Julia Child was there. It's this sort of old and dusty and musty, beautiful. They have everything you could ever imagine. Copper pots that, would make you so jealous. And when she was in Paris for an official visit, she had them close the store so that she could go browse and buy things to take back and use to make Thanksgiving for her family. And if I was the vice president of the United States, I would absolutely make the Secret Service close down Ida Hilleran anytime I was nearby. And that was the moment when I said, you know what? She knows what's going on.
Oh, she spoke to you there. Okay, that's good. Yeah,
absolutely.
That there was a connection there.
And I think that the American people are ready for a foodie president.
Yeah, we will see. We will see.
It's about time.
We don't have a whole lot of history here, but this is good to know.
Another glass ceiling to break, or maybe a pastry ceiling. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing this recording on short notice. Obviously, we're we have a lot of topics we want to discuss over the next few months, but this one came up and seemed pretty darn important. So we're glad we're able to discuss that. Thank you all for tuning in.
It's great to hear your perspective on it. And, I think a lot of us thought this was going to be a boring election, and it doesn't look quite so boring anymore.
No, we never get boring anymore, do we? All right. Well, thank you so much, John. Thank you all for listening. Bye-bye. Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Masket. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.